Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever wondered what happens when a rising political star suddenly finds themselves at the center of a federal storm that could change everything? Well, today we're diving deep into a story that has sent shockwaves through Congress and left an entire congressional district asking one crucial question. What is really happening with Sheila Cherfilus-McCormick? This isn't just another political scandal that will fade away in a news cycle. This is a story about ambition, allegations, and the kind of federal charges that can destroy careers overnight. Because on November 19th, 2025, the political world watched as a congresswoman who had fought tooth and nail to reach the halls of power suddenly faced the possibility of losing everything she had worked for. But here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating, and why you need to stick around until the end. This case involves $5 million in federal disaster funds, a family health care business, campaign finance violations, and a web of financial arrangements so complex that investigators have been untangling it for years. We're talking about allegations that could result in 53 years in prison if proven true. Now, before we dive into the explosive details that have emerged from this federal indictment, let me give you some context that will blow your mind. Sheila Cherfilus-McCormick isn't just any congresswoman. She holds the distinction of being the only Haitian-American Democrat ever elected to Congress. Her journey to Washington was marked by persistence that would make most people give up, and her rise to power came with a financial mystery that investigators are still trying to solve. Here's what's going to shock you about this entire situation. The timing of these charges, the amounts of money involved, and the interconnected web of family businesses and political campaigns creates a story that reads like a political thriller. But this isn't fiction, and the stakes couldn't be higher for everyone involved. So, what exactly happened that brought federal prosecutors to her doorstep? The indictment alleges that in 2021, while Cherfilus-McCormick was CEO of Trinity Healthcare Services, her family company received a staggering $5 million overpayment through a FEMA-funded COVID vaccination staffing contract. But here's where the story takes a dramatic turn that investigators say crosses the line from business mistake to federal crime. According to prosecutors, this wasn't just an accounting error that got overlooked. They allege that Cherfilus-McCormick and her brother Edwin knew about this overpayment, and instead of returning the money to the federal government, they engaged in what prosecutors are calling a sophisticated money laundering scheme. The goal, according to the indictment, was to funnel a substantial portion of these disaster relief funds directly into her congressional campaign. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about money that was meant to help communities recover from a global pandemic being allegedly redirected to fund a political campaign. If these allegations are true, it represents one of the most brazen misuses of federal disaster relief funds that we've seen in recent memory. But the story gets even more complex when you understand how Cherfilus-McCormick managed to finance her successful 2021 campaign. Campaign records show that she loaned an incredible $3.7 million to her own campaign organization. For most people, that kind of personal wealth would represent a lifetime of savings. But for Cherfilus-McCormick, it apparently came from a sudden and dramatic increase in her income. Here's what should raise red flags for anyone paying attention to this case. The Office of Congressional Ethics discovered that Cherfilus-McCormick's income increased by more than $6 million in 2021 compared to 2020. Nearly $5.75 million of that increase came from consulting and profit-sharing fees from Trinity Healthcare Services. The timing of this windfall coincides exactly with when her family company received the federal contract that allegedly resulted in the $5 million overpayment. During her 2021 campaign, while promoting progressive policies including a Green New Deal and Medicare for All, less than 1% of her campaign funding came from individual donations. 88% of her campaign war chest, nearly $4 million, was self-financed. This level of self-funding is extraordinary for any congressional candidate, but it becomes particularly suspicious when you consider the source of that personal wealth. The federal indictment doesn't stop at allegations of money laundering disaster relief funds. Prosecutors also claim that Cherfilus-McCormick worked with co-defendant Nadege LeBlanc to arrange additional contributions using what are called straw donors. This alleged scheme involved funneling money from the FEMA contract to friends and relatives, who then made campaign donations as if they were using their own personal funds. If you're wondering how sophisticated this alleged operation was, consider this additional charge in the indictment. Cherfilus-McCormick and her 2021 tax preparer David K. Spencer are accused of conspiring to file a false federal tax return. The allegations include claiming personal and political expenses as business deductions and inflating charitable contributions to reduce tax obligations. This isn't just about one questionable transaction or a single oversight in campaign finance reporting. The indictment paints a picture of a systematic effort to exploit federal disaster relief programs for personal and political gain, while simultaneously deceiving tax authorities about the true nature of these financial arrangements. What makes this case particularly damaging for Cherfilus-McCormick is that the allegations strike at the heart of public trust in elected officials. She represented herself as a champion of progressive causes and someone who would fight for working families, yet prosecutors allege she was secretly enriching herself with money intended to help communities recover from a devastating pandemic. The Trinity Healthcare Services controversy has been following Cherfilus-McCormick throughout her congressional tenure, like a shadow that refuses to disappear. In December 2024, the Florida Division of Emergency Management filed its own lawsuit against Trinity Healthcare Services, alleging the company overcharged the state by nearly $5.8 million for pandemic-related work and refused to return the money. While Trinity Healthcare eventually reached a settlement agreement requiring the company to pay back $5.6 million through installment payments extending until 2040, the damage to Cherfilus-McCormick's reputation was already done. The settlement essentially confirmed that her family company had indeed received millions more than it was entitled to from government contracts. The House Ethics Committee has been investigating Cherfilus-McCormick since December 2023 over complaints involving potential campaign finance violations, improper disclosure failures, and questionable hiring practices. She has consistently denied all allegations, but the mounting evidence from multiple investigations has created a perfect storm of legal and political problems. What's particularly striking about this case is how it reveals the interconnected nature of Cherfilus-McCormick's business and political operations. Her husband, Corley McCormick Jr., and sister-in-law, Chantrell McCormick, serve as registered agents for Progressive People Incorporated, a Florida LLC that sent $725,000 to Truth and Justice Incorporated, a tax-exempt nonprofit that allegedly allowed consultant access to root campaign payments. This labyrinthine network of business entities and financial arrangements has created what prosecutors describe as a complex scheme designed to obscure the true source and destination of funds flowing between her family's business interests and her political campaigns. The Federal Election Commission opened its own investigation into Cherfilus-McCormick in September, following complaints that accused her 2021 campaign of concealing in-kind contributions tied to her family and consultant, Mark Goodrich. When multiple federal agencies are investigating the same person for related financial improprieties, it typically signals that the allegations are both serious and well documented. As we continue to unpack this explosive story, you're going to discover how Cherfilus-McCormick's path to Congress was marked by determination that ultimately may have led to her downfall. Her journey to Washington reads like a political underdog story that Hollywood would struggle to make believable. Born in Brooklyn to Haitian parents and raised in Queens, Cherfilus-McCormick moved to Florida at age 13 and eventually earned her law degree from St. Thomas University. But what happened next reveals the kind of relentless ambition that would either make her a political success or create the conditions for her current legal nightmare. Picture this scenario for a moment. You're facing off against Alcee Hastings, a political giant who had held Florida's 20th congressional district since 1993. Most challengers would take one loss and move on to other opportunities. But Cherfilus-McCormick wasn't most challengers. She challenged Hastings in 2018 and got absolutely crushed, winning only 26.4% of the vote. Any reasonable person would have seen this as a sign to pursue other career paths. Instead, she came back swinging in 2020, this time citing ethics concerns and health issues surrounding Hastings as reasons for her campaign. She improved her performance, but still lost decisively with 30.7% of the vote. At this point, most political observers would have written her off as a perennial candidate who couldn't break through against an entrenched incumbent. But here's where the story takes a turn that reveals either incredible persistence or dangerous obsession. When Hastings died in April of 2021, Cherfilus-McCormick saw her opening and seized it with both hands. The special election that followed became one of the closest congressional races in recent memory, and what happened next would change everything. She won the Democratic primary by exactly 5 votes over Broward County Commissioner Dale Holness after a recount. 5 votes. Think about how razor-thin that margin is and how it meant the difference between political obscurity and a seat in Congress. But winning by such a narrow margin also meant that every aspect of her campaign would face intense scrutiny. And that scrutiny is exactly what led investigators to start digging into her financial arrangements. The campaign that secured her this narrow victory was unlike anything most congressional candidates could even dream of mounting. While her opponents were scraping together donations from local supporters and interest groups, Cherfilus-McCormick was writing massive checks to her own campaign from what appeared to be an inexhaustible personal fortune. Campaign finance experts started asking uncomfortable questions almost immediately. Where does a healthcare company CEO suddenly acquire millions of dollars in liquid assets that can be immediately deployed for political purposes? The timing of her newfound wealth coincided perfectly with her family company's lucrative federal contracts, creating a timeline that prosecutors would later use to build their case. Here's what makes her 2021 victory even more remarkable and suspicious. She was promoting progressive policies that typically appeal to working-class voters, including a $1,000 a month universal basic income proposal. Yet her campaign was almost entirely self-funded by someone who had apparently become wealthy enough to loan herself nearly $4 million while running for a job that pays $174,000 annually. The disconnect between her populist message and her mysterious personal wealth created cognitive dissonance that political observers couldn't ignore. How do you credibly advocate for economic policies designed to help struggling families when you're simultaneously demonstrating the kind of personal wealth that puts you in the top 1% of Americans? After securing her upset primary victory, Cherfilus-McCormick easily defeated Republican Jason Mariner in the January 2022 general election, which was hardly surprising given that her district is configured as the most heavily Democratic among Florida's 28 congressional districts. The Cook Political Report rates it as D plus 22, meaning it performed 22 points more Democratic than the nation in recent presidential elections. This electoral security should have provided her with a stable foundation to build a long congressional career. Instead, it may have given her a false sense of invincibility that contributed to the alleged schemes that prosecutors are now unraveling. When you represent a district where the Democratic primary winner is almost guaranteed to win the general election, the real accountability comes from federal investigators rather than Republican opponents. Her first full term in Congress showcased exactly the kind of progressive credentials that her district expected. She supported President Biden's positions 100% of the time according to 538 analysis, and she secured positions on significant committees including the House Committee on Veterans Affairs and as ranking member of the subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa. But even as she was building her congressional resume, the investigations that would eventually bring federal charges were already underway. The House Ethics Committee had been quietly gathering evidence about her business dealings, and multiple federal agencies were beginning to coordinate their efforts to understand the complex financial arrangements surrounding Trinity Healthcare Services. The 2022 election cycle provided another test of her political durability. Dale Holness, the commissioner she had narrowly defeated in the special election, decided to challenge her again in the regular Democratic primary. This time, the results weren't even close. Cherfilus-McCormick won decisively with 66% to his 27%, then cruised to victory in the November general election with 72% of the vote against Republican nominee Drew Montez Clark. Her 2024 re-election was even more dominant, with no challengers in either the Democratic primary or general election. She won completely unopposed, which should have been the ultimate validation of her political standing in the district. Instead, this landslide victory occurred while federal prosecutors were already building the case that would result in her indictment just months later. What's particularly fascinating about the timeline of these investigations is how they reveal the methodical approach that federal prosecutors take when building complex financial crimes cases. The initial complaints and ethics investigations began almost immediately after she took office, but it took nearly 4 years to develop the evidence necessary for a federal indictment. This lengthy investigation period suggests that prosecutors weren't dealing with simple campaign finance violations or straightforward corruption charges. Instead, they were untangling what they describe as a sophisticated scheme involving multiple business entities, family members, and financial intermediaries designed to obscure the true source and destination of funds. The complexity of this alleged scheme becomes apparent when you consider all the moving pieces that investigators had to track. Trinity Healthcare Services was registered to her mother and stepfather, Marie and Gabriel Smith, with her brother Edwin Cherfilus listed as Vice President of Operations. Her husband and sister-in-law served as registered agents for other business entities that allegedly facilitated financial transfers between the healthcare company and various political operations. But just as Cherfilus-McCormick thought she had weathered the worst of the scrutiny, a new political challenge emerged that would test her ability to maintain power while facing federal charges. In 2025, just as federal prosecutors were putting the finishing touches on their indictment, a 26-year-old substitute teacher and activist named Elijah Manley announced his primary challenge for 2026. What happened next reveals just how desperate Cherfilus-McCormick's situation has become and how she's chosen to handle critics who dare to question her record. Manley didn't just file paperwork and hope for the best. He built his entire campaign around allegations of corruption against Cherfilus-McCormick, and the results shocked everyone who follows Florida politics. Between July and September 2025, this political newcomer outraised the sitting congresswoman, bringing in $114,000 in donations compared to her $68,000. Think about what that fundraising disparity means for a moment. Here's an incumbent member of Congress with all the advantages that come with holding federal office, including access to established donor networks and political action committee support. Yet, she's being outraised by a substitute teacher whose primary qualification is his willingness to call her corrupt in public. The fundraising numbers tell a story that goes beyond simple campaign metrics. They reveal that even Democratic donors in her own district are starting to have serious doubts about whether Cherfilus-McCormick can survive the federal charges and continue to effectively represent their interests in Congress. But rather than addressing these concerns through transparency, or by directly answering questions about the allegations, Cherfilus-McCormick chose a different strategy that reveals everything you need to know about her current mindset. In September 2025, she filed a $1 million defamation lawsuit against Manley, claiming he spread what she called blatant lies about her record and reputation. The lawsuit specifically targets campaign advertisements where Manley called her a crook and referenced her ongoing House Ethics Committee investigation. For someone who claims to be innocent of all charges, filing a $1 million lawsuit against a substitute teacher seems like an awfully aggressive response to what should be considered normal political criticism. Manley has called the lawsuit frivolous, and frankly, it's hard to disagree with that assessment. When you're facing federal charges that could result in 53 years in prison, suing your political opponents for calling you corrupt seems like a waste of time and resources that would be better spent on criminal defense attorneys. The tension between these two candidates reached peak absurdity at an October 2025 town hall meeting that became a viral moment for all the wrong reasons. The heated exchange ended with Cherfilus-McCormick repeatedly telling Manley "your mama," which is exactly the kind of professional comportment you'd expect from someone representing Florida's 20th congressional district in the United States Congress. This wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment under pressure. The defamation lawsuit filed in Broward County reveals a pattern of trying to silence critics through legal intimidation rather than addressing substantive concerns about her conduct. The lawsuit cites a July 5th Instagram video where Manley accused her of taking $5.7 million in taxpayer funds and moving them to her campaign accounts. So, there you have it, folks. The complete story of how a congresswoman who won by just 5 votes now faces 53 years behind bars for allegedly turning disaster relief money into campaign cash. From her meteoric rise through sheer determination to a federal indictment that could end it all, Sheila Cherfilus-McCormick's story proves that in politics, what goes up can come crashing down faster than anyone imagines.